She was 73 years old when they told her to leave, just 10 days after she'd buried the man she had loved for over 3 decades. And what made it worse was that the only thing he had left her, the only thing they hadn't already taken, was something they all laughed at. A useless, forgotten hilltop ruin miles away that no one in their right mind would ever choose to live in. Or so they thought. Eleanor Whitaker had never imagined her life would unravel this way. Not at this age. Not after everything she had poured into a marriage that she believed, perhaps foolishly, had made her part of a real family. The house she stood in had been her home for 32 years, a place filled with routines so deeply ingrained that even grief couldn't erase them. She still woke early, still reached for the second coffee cup out of habit, still paused in the hallway expecting to hear her husband's voice call her name. But the silence that followed his passing was not the kind that allowed healing. It was the kind that made room for something colder to take its place. His children, Daniel and Marissa, arrived not with comfort, but with quiet efficiency. At first, they spoke in careful tones, offering polite condolences, discussing arrangements, tying up loose ends. Eleanor mistook it for grief. She mistook their distance for restraint. But within days, the conversations shifted, becoming sharper, more precise, until finally the truth was laid out plainly across the dining table, where she had once hosted countless family dinners. The house was not hers, the assets were not hers, and according to the will, one she had never seen until that moment, she had no legal claim to remain. There was no dramatic argument, no raised voices echoing through the halls. Daniel simply slid a folder toward her, his expression flat, almost bored, as if he were explaining a minor inconvenience rather than dismantling someone's entire life. "We'll need you to vacate within 30 days, he said, as though he were discussing a rental agreement instead of the home she had helped maintain, decorate, and fill with life for over 3 decades. Eleanor stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly, not because she didn't understand them, but because she understood them all too well. Her name wasn't there, not on the deed, not in the ownership clauses, not anywhere that mattered. It was as if she had never existed in the legal framework of the life she had lived. She looked up, searching their faces for something, guilt, hesitation, anything, but found none. Marissa avoided her gaze entirely, focusing instead on her phone, while Daniel leaned back in his chair, already mentally moving on to whatever came next. "Your father wouldn't have wanted this," Eleanor said quietly, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized how fragile they sounded. Daniel's response came without pause. "This is exactly what he arranged." That was the moment something inside her shifted. Not broken, not yet, but loosened, like a foundation beginning to crack under pressure. The days that followed moved with a strange, disorienting speed. Boxes appeared. Closets were emptied. Drawers that once held decades of shared memories were reduced to items sorted into keep, discard, or donate. Eleanor moved through it all like a ghost, present but unseen, her input neither requested nor required. She tried, once, to protest, to suggest that there must have been some mistake, that perhaps there was something overlooked, but Daniel shut it down with a simple sentence. "Everything has been reviewed." And just like that, her life was reduced to finality. On the 29th day, she stood in the living room, now stripped of its warmth, holding the last of her belongings. 2 suitcases, a handbag, and 1 envelope. It had been handed to her almost as an afterthought, something Daniel had nearly forgotten to give her as he oversaw the clearing of the house. This was mentioned separately, he had said, his tone dismissive. "It's yours." She hadn't opened it right away. Not then, not in front of them. Instead, she waited until she was outside, the cold autumn air biting at her face as she stood on the curb, the place that had once been her home now reduced to a structure behind her, a structure she was no longer allowed to enter. Only then did she open it, her fingers slow, deliberate, as if prolonging the moment might somehow soften whatever waited inside. There was no letter, no explanation, just a single document, a deed. The description was brief, almost vague. Hilltop property, Greene County. No details, no context, nothing to suggest why this, of all things, had been left to her. She read it twice, then a third time, hoping something would change, that some hidden meaning would reveal itself, but it remained exactly what it appeared to be, a transfer of ownership for a piece of land she had never heard of. When she showed it to Daniel earlier, before she left, he had actually laughed. A short, dismissive sound that lingered longer than it should have. "That place," he said. "You can have it. It's falling apart. Not worth anything." At the time, she had felt a flicker of humiliation, as though even in death, her husband had left her with something insignificant, something that confirmed what his children clearly believed, that she was an afterthought, an obligation at best, a mistake at worst. And yet, standing there now, with nowhere else to go, that worthless deed suddenly carried a different weight. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't security. But it was something. And when you have nothing, something, no matter how small, how uncertain, becomes impossible to ignore. Eleanor closed the envelope carefully, holding it a little tighter than before, as if it might disappear if she didn't. She looked back at the house one last time, not with anger, but with a quiet, aching finality. Then she turned away. By the time Eleanor Whitaker reached the Hilltop property, the sun was already slipping behind the distant ridges, casting long shadows across land that looked as though it had been forgotten not just by people, but by time itself. And for a moment, standing there with the wind tugging at her coat and the silence pressing in from all sides, she wondered if her stepchildren had been right to laugh, because nothing about this place suggested safety or comfort or even the possibility of starting over. It looked like an ending, not a beginning. The road that led up to it had barely qualified as a road at all, more a narrow stretch of cracked dirt and stubborn weeds that resisted her every step as if trying to turn her back. And when she finally reached the top, all she could do was stand still and take it in. The structure that her husband had left her wasn't a house in any real sense of the word, but a sagging, weather-beaten shell, its roof partially collapsed on one side, its windows shattered or boarded unevenly, and its porch tilted just enough to make it seem like the whole thing might give up and slide down the hill at any moment. "This can't be it," she whispered, though there was no one there to hear her, no one to confirm or deny what her eyes were already telling her. She checked the address again, her hands stiff from the cold, her breath visible in the fading light, and each detail matched exactly what was written on the deed. This was hers. This ruin. This silence. This isolation. For a brief, dangerous moment, she considered turning around, going back down the hill, finding a motel, a shelter, anything that didn't look like it might collapse around her while she slept. But the reality she had been avoiding settled in with quiet certainty. She didn't have the money for that, not for more than a night or two, and even if she did, it wouldn't solve anything. This place, as impossible as it seemed, was the only thing she owned in the world. So she stepped forward. The front door resisted at first, swollen from years of neglect, but with a firm push, it gave way with a sharp creak that echoed unnaturally loud in the empty space beyond. The air inside was colder than outside, carrying the scent of damp wood, dust, and something older, something settled deep into the bones of the structure itself. Eleanor hesitated on the threshold, her instincts urging caution, but there was nowhere else to go, so she crossed it, the floorboards groaning softly beneath her weight, as if acknowledging her presence after years of abandonment. The interior was dim, lit only by the last traces of daylight filtering through broken panes and gaps in the walls, revealing a space that had once been a home, though it was difficult to imagine now. Furniture remained in fragments, an overturned chair, a table missing a leg, shelves lined with objects so coated in dust they had lost their identity. And yet, beneath the decay, there was something strangely intact about it, as though time had paused rather than completely erased what had been. Here, she moved slowly, her movements careful, deliberate, as she explored the main room, then what must have been a kitchen, then a narrow hallway that led to two smaller rooms, each in similar states of disrepair, and with every step, the weight of her situation pressed in a little more, because this wasn't temporary. This wasn't something she could endure for a night or two. If she stayed, this would be her reality. Night came quickly on the hilltop, the darkness settling in with a completeness that city life had never prepared her for, and with it came the cold, sharper now, more insistent, slipping through cracks in the walls and broken sections of the roof, as though invited. Eleanor found an old blanket in what might have once been a bedroom closet, shaking it out despite the dust, and wrapped it tightly around herself as she sat against the least damaged wall she could find, her suitcase beside her, her back aching from the long day and the longer weeks that had led to it. She didn't cry, not then, but sleep came in fragments, broken by the unfamiliar sounds of the structure settling, the wind moving through it like a low whisper, and the constant awareness that she was alone in a place no one else seemed to remember. Morning didn't bring warmth, but it brought light, and with it, a slightly different perspective. The ruin, harsh as it still was, revealed details she hadn't noticed the night before. A stack of old firewood near the back door, weathered but usable. A cast iron stove tucked into the corner of the main room, rusted but not beyond recognition. A set of tools hanging on a wall in what had once been a small storage area. Basic, worn, but functional. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing, and something in Eleanor responded to that. Something quiet but steady that refused to give in completely. She began, almost without thinking, to move things, clearing a small space, dragging debris aside, opening what remained of the windows to let in fresh air, even though it carried the chill with it. And as the hours passed, the place shifted, not dramatically, not enough to call it livable, but enough to suggest possibility. It was sometime in the early afternoon, while she was attempting to clear a section of the wall in what she believed had been the main living area, that she noticed it. A seam that didn't quite align with the rest of the paneling, subtle enough to miss unless you were looking closely, or perhaps unless you had nothing else to focus on. At first, she ignored it, assuming it was just another sign of the house's uneven aging. But something about it lingered in her mind, drawing her back until she finally reached out and pressed against it. The panel shifted slightly under her hand. She paused, her breath catching, then pushed again, harder this time, and with a dull, reluctant sound, it gave way just enough to reveal darkness behind it. Eleanor stepped back instinctively, her heart beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden, unexpected sense that there was more to this place than she had been led to believe. Carefully, she pulled the panel further aside, revealing a narrow opening and, beyond it, a set of wooden steps descending into shadow. A cellar, hidden, or at least not immediately visible. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring down into it, weighing the decision without fully realizing she was doing so. She could leave it, pretend she hadn't found it. There was enough to deal with already. But then, another thought surfaced, quieter, but stronger. This was the only thing her husband had left her, and he had never been careless. Taking a steadying breath, Eleanor found a flashlight in her back, one of the few practical things she had thought to bring, and stepped toward the opening, the beam of light cutting through the darkness as she began her descent, each step creaking underfoot, the air growing cooler, heavier, as though it had been sealed away for years. When she reached the bottom, the space opened slightly, not large, but clearly used at some point, and as she swept the light across it, shapes began to take form. Stacked crates, old shelves, boxes arranged with a kind of deliberate order that didn't match the chaos upstairs. She moved closer, her curiosity now fully awakened, and brushed dust away from the nearest crate, revealing markings beneath. Labels, faint but legible. Documents, records, names she didn't recognize. And then, on a smaller table set apart from the rest, something that made her stop completely. A bundle of letters, tied together. The paper aged, but preserved. Slowly, almost carefully, as if the moment itself required it, Eleanor reached out and picked them up, her fingers tracing the edges before she untied the string. She didn't need to read the first line to recognize the handwriting. It was his, her husband's. And in that instant, standing alone in the dim cellar of a crumbling house on a hill no one else seemed to want, Eleanor realized something that shifted. Everything she thought she understood, not about the property, not about her situation, but about him. Because this place hadn't been forgotten. It had been kept, waiting. Eleanor didn't climb back up those cellar steps right away, because something had shifted so completely in that moment that the cold, the exhaustion, even the uncertainty that had followed her for weeks seemed to fall into the background, replaced by a quiet, growing awareness that this place, this broken, overlooked place, was not what it appeared to be, and perhaps never had been. She sat down on the lowest step, the bundle of letters resting in her lap, her hands steadier now than they had been in days. And for the first time since she had been forced out of her home, she didn't feel like she was reacting to something that had already been decided for her. She felt like she was standing at the beginning of something that had been waiting. The first letter was dated years earlier, long before her husband had fallen ill, long before the distance between him and his children had hardened into something unfixable. And as she read, slowly at first, then with growing focus, she realized these weren't letters meant to be sent. They were records, thoughts, plans, written in a voice she recognized immediately, but had never heard expressed this way, unfiltered and deliberate. He wrote about the Hilltop property not as an afterthought, but as a decision, something he had held onto quietly, deliberately, separate from everything else in his life, including the family that now controlled what had once been their shared home. He wrote about its location, about the surrounding land, about changes he had seen coming years before anyone else seemed to notice, development pushing outward, land being acquired, small properties suddenly becoming valuable for reasons that weren't obvious at first glance. Eleanor felt her breath catch as she turned to the next letter, then the next, each one adding another layer to something she hadn't known existed, because her husband, the man she had believed she understood completely, had been preparing for something, planning for something, and somehow, she had never seen it. One letter, written more recently, stopped her completely, her eyes lingering on the words as if reading them once wasn't enough to make them real. If things unfold the way I suspect they might, this place will matter. Not to them, they won't see it, but to you. Don't let first impressions decide anything. Stay. Look deeper. Eleanor lowered the paper slowly, her mind catching up to what her instincts had already begun to understand. And for the first time since Daniel had slid those eviction papers across the table, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Not anger, not grief, but clarity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a meaningless gesture. Her husband had known exactly what he was leaving her, and perhaps more importantly, he had known exactly how it would be dismissed by everyone else. She stayed in the cellar longer than she realized, going through the crates one by one, uncovering documents that seemed, at first, disconnected. Old surveys, land records, correspondence with people she didn't recognize, but gradually formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. This Hilltop property wasn't just a structure. It was part of something larger, something that had been quietly increasing in significance while the world around it overlooked it. By the time she climbed back upstairs, the light had shifted toward evening again, but everything felt different now, as though the house itself had changed in response to what she had discovered, though in reality, it was Eleanor who had changed. The next days passed in a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and necessary. She worked in the mornings, clearing more of the house, making small repairs where she could, learning the limits of what she was capable of, and pushing them carefully, deliberately. In the afternoons, she returned to the cellar, studying the documents more closely, organizing them, piecing together what her husband had seen years before it became obvious to anyone else. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the picture became clear. The land surrounding her property was being evaluated, quietly, strategically, by developers who were planning something large enough to require not just one parcel, but many. And hers, positioned at the highest point, wasn't just part of that plan, it was central to it. The proof of that realization came sooner than she expected. It started with small signs, markers placed at the edges of the property, subtle enough to go unnoticed if you weren't looking for them, followed by a man walking the perimeter one afternoon, clipboard in hand, who seemed surprised to find her there at all. Didn't realize anyone was still using this place, he said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharper than his words suggested. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She had learned something important in the past weeks. Silence, used correctly, could reveal more than questions. It's my property, she said finally, her voice calm, steady in a way that would have surprised the woman she had been just a month earlier. The man nodded, though something in his expression shifted, calculating now, reassessing. You might be hearing from someone soon, he said, as if offering helpful information, but Eleanor understood what it really was, a signal. And he was right. Within a week, the first offer arrived. It came in the form of a letter, professionally worded, carefully framed to sound generous, while revealing as little as possible about the urgency behind it. The number, though, was enough to make her pause. It wasn't life-changing, not yet, but it was far from worthless. She thought of Daniel's laugh when he had dismissed the property, of the way he had waved it off as if it were nothing, and for a brief moment, something close to satisfaction flickered through her. Then a second offer came, higher, then a third, each one arriving faster than the last, each one revealing, without ever stating it directly, that what she had was not just wanted, it was needed. And that was when her stepchildren returned. This time, there were no polite condolences, no careful distance. Daniel called first, his tone measured, controlled in a way that suggested he was trying very hard to keep something beneath the surface. "We should talk," he said. "There are aspects of the estate that may need to be reviewed." Eleanor almost smiled, not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. She had heard that tone before, though never directed at her. "There's nothing to review," she replied simply. There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to confirm what she already knew. This wasn't about concern, or fairness, or even family. It was about value. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said finally. And for the first time, Eleanor answered without hesitation. "No," she said, her voice steady, grounded in something far stronger than it had been weeks before. "I think I do." When she hung up, she didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindictive. What she felt was something quieter, but far more powerful, a sense of ownership that went beyond the deed, beyond the documents, beyond even the land itself. She walked out onto the hilltop as the sun began to set. The same view she had seen on her first night, now stretching out before her in a completely different way. And she realized that the ruin her husband had left her hadn't just given her a place to go when she had nowhere else. It had given her something no one had expected her to have again. Control. And as the offers continued to come, and the pressure from those who had once dismissed her quietly grew, Eleanor didn't rush, didn't react, didn't allow herself to be pushed into decisions that served anyone but herself. Because for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't being told where she belonged or what she was worth. She was deciding it. And the hilltop, once overlooked, once dismissed as nothing, stood as proof of something no one else had seen coming. That sometimes, what looks like the end of everything is actually the beginning of something no one else thought to claim.